All right, tonight we are in a new year, so I think it's time to jump to a new arena of biblical ethics. We spent several weeks in the arena of a life-preserving ethic, talking about life and death issues that deal with morality and such. Tonight, we're going to make the transition in our study of Christian ethics to a sexually pure ethic. So for the next few weeks, we're going to be focused on ethical issues that deal with sex and sexuality. But as I did with the life and death ethical arena, I want to start with a general overview of what the Bible has to say on this subject matter. And then week by week after this, we'll deal with specific situations and specific topics. But first, we just need to appreciate group around what the Bible has to say on this particular subject matter. And so we're going to simply take our time tonight and explore what biblical teachings should impact our understanding and application of sexual ethics. And I may not hit on everything that we could hit on tonight, but we need a starting point, and that's what we're going to do. So as we consider sexual ethics, we're going to start with this, the fact that God created sex. Now, let's be honest, within the context of the church, we don't like to talk about this subject. We try to avoid it, and people get really uncomfortable when you're having the sex conversations and sex studies in the realm of the church. The one benefit I have right now is the fact that we don't have kids in here, which makes a lot of parents happy. I get a lot of complaints when I do speak on, when I use the word sex too much in a sermon, I start getting texts afterwards. So tonight, we have no one under the age of 17 in here. So hopefully you won't get bothered by how many times I have to use the word sex tonight. But that's going to be our arena for the next several weeks, so we've got to address it. But let's start with this. God created sex. It was part of His design. We can't ignore that fact. No matter it's in the Bible. So when we think about our biblical stance, the ethical arena of sex, we have to start here that God created the sex when He created the first humans. The Bible affirms this. You can go to we're going to spend a lot of time in the first few chapters of Genesis, so you might want to go ahead and turn there. But when God created man and woman, and actually He kind of started this before He got to man and woman, because when He created the fish and the birds and the livestock and the creeping things on the face of the earth, He gave all of them the commission of being male and female and of reproduction. When we get to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, the same thing happens for humans. And one thing we need to acknowledge as we acknowledge the fact that God created sex when He created the first humans, we need to note that He created the human body gender specific. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over the livestock, and over all of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them. So you have at the start of creation, God creates mankind, creates humans, and He does so with two specific opposite genders. Instantaneously, He's created sex by creating two genders. Now, when we say that He created two genders, we have to acknowledge that He created our physical bodies and intentionally created them in opposing ways. And He's therefore the originator of gender, and He's the originator of sex. He's the only one who's designed, he's the one who designed us as boy, girl, men, women, male, female. And when He finalized that first day of creation, keep this in mind. He creates mankind. He creates two genders. He's ultimately, as we're going to see as we go through this, creating sex. And at the end of that first day, at the end of that sixth day, he looks at everything he made, including the human body, including genders, including sex, and he says it was very good. I bring that up because we have to acknowledge that everything God created was good, even the things that we don't want to talk about, even the things that we can have uncomfortable conversation about. Sex in and of itself is not wrong, not sinful, not a bad thing. It's God created, and it has its place and its purpose, and we'll address that more as we move along. But God created the human body gender specific. That's just one way in which we can see that He's the creator of sex. Also, God created the human body to be physically attractive. Now, not every body is physically attractive. I'm proof of that. But God created us to be attracted to people. Now, where in the Bible does it say that, Kyle? Well, let's start with this. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 19, Adam's all alone. He's the only creature, only human on the face of the earth. And God has this plan. God arranges for all of the animals that He's created to parade before Adam, and with the specific instructions for Adam to name them. But I think God has a bigger thing going on than just getting identifications for the animals. I think He wants Adam to see that nothing else on the face of the earth matches him. Because it's immediately after this parade of the animals, this naming of the animals, that God causes a deep sleep to come over Adam. And while Adam's asleep, he goes in and grabs one of those ribs and forms Eve. And so when Adam awakens, there's this complementary creature in his presence that he's attracted to. She's not like all these other things he's seen. She's different. She makes sense. And he awakens and he says, "This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." Yes, that's a reference to how she was created, but it's also a reference to the uniqueness of this relationship that's about to form. And let's think about this. Does anybody know what book of the Bible gets preached on the least? This is opinion, it's subjective. What do you think the least preached on book of the Bible is? What was that? Song of Solomon. All right, well, we get a good reference to that tonight. Turn in your Bibles to Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, chapter 4. And just take a moment and scan the first 7 verses. Now, I'm sure all of you know to some degree that Song of Solomon is more of this romantic literature. It's classified as wisdom literature, but you have this romantic kind of thing happening between the author and his love. God has allowed the Song of Solomon to be in our Bibles for a reason, because we need to understand that romance and all that accompanies that is part of God's plan and will. And if you scan, as I've given you a little bit of time here, scan those first few verses of Song of Solomon chapter 4, one thing that stands out in those first 7 verses is he's describing the beauty of her appearance. Not in terms that you and I would use. I would never go to Sarah and say, "Your eyes are doves." That would probably not go over well. But it works for him. "Your hair is like a flock of goats." Man, that's romantic. But you go through those first 7 verses, it starts with, behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. It ends with, "You are altogether beautiful, my love. There is no flaw in you." Now that is romantic. And in between that, he's describing her neck. He's describing her teeth. I thought that was the weirdest one. He's describing her physical beauty because God has made us to be physically attracted to one another. That's part of the design. And we don't need to shy away from that. We don't need to ignore that. Part of the reason you can say that God created sex is because, one, he created the two genders and he created physical attraction as part of the equation. But we also need to note that God created sex because he's the one who ordained procreation and intimacy. He's the one that authorized that. He's the one that created it. Immediately following the statement in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27 that God made mankind male and female, we're told that God instructed the first man and the first woman to be fruitful and multiply. Now that was the catalyst for our lesson on Sunday that had nothing to do with reproduction physically. But what God immediately instructs, the first command he gives mankind is a procreative command. He's commanding them to reproduce, and the only means at their disposal to fulfill this command was through a sexual relationship. So God's first instruction for mankind centered around sex. It should be noted that this initial instruction regarding sex is stated in the context of the created order of the universe that God affirmed was, as I mentioned earlier, very good there in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. So it's part of God's design. But that's not the only reason God created two genders. Procreation was not the only reason God instituted sex. God created Eve, a woman, because according to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 20, there was not found a helper fit for Adam, who's a man. Scripture included this information to show that women, or that the woman was specifically constructed to fulfill every need that the man had, including his need for intimacy, because he didn't match with any other creature. And what I find so very fascinating is that the Hebrew word used to address the sexual relationship between spouses throughout the book of Genesis is the verb to know. Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, Adam knew Eve, and she conceived. Now, this word refers to intimate knowledge. It doesn't mean that Adam was aware of Eve's existence. It doesn't mean that he was cognizant of facts about her life. No, this is referring to the intimate connection he has with her that takes a physical form, that can lead to conception. So sex was created by God for the purpose of fulfilling the procreation command, but it was also created by God to fulfill man and woman's need for intimacy. And that means that the pleasurable aspect of sex was also created by God, not just the logical reproductive purpose. So when all of this is taken together, the fact that God created our bodies with gender differences, that God created our bodies to be physically attractive, and that God created our bodies for sexual activity, we must assert that sex is a God-given gift for mankind. So as we address a sexual ethic, we're not just going to be addressing the negative side of it. There is a positive side of it as well. But we do need to acknowledge that even though God is the originator of this, he did have some boundaries, because God created sex when he created humans, but he also created boundaries when he instituted marriage. So you go back to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. You have this introduction of Adam and Eve to one another, and then we're told, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, we never have a wedding ceremony. There's nothing like that happening. Adam and Eve didn't really have options. It was kind of, hey, you and me, it's just us. But the first reference here to a marriage, I mean, did you pay attention to the language there? A man and his wife. A man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. Oh, I forgot to add the verse to that one. I think I did that to another one. After God created Eve and introduced her to Adam, he initiated the first marriage. And we know that this is a reference to marriage, not just because of the language of man and wife, but also because Jesus uses this to talk about marriage in his interactions with people in his day. So you can go to Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 6, where Jesus will say, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." Jesus appeals to this passage when he's questioned about divorce and remarriage. He's affirming that this is a marital scenario and that it was orchestrated, initiated by God. And it's after initiating this first marriage that God indicated it's within this relationship that a sexual relationship is permitted. So that's what the phrase, "they shall become one flesh," is referring to. God intentionally used the Hebrew term for flesh in that passage to emphasize, as one author said, the physical aspect of the married couple's relationship. If God intended to downplay the sexual aspect and emphasize the unity of their person, then a more fitting word would have been soul. It would have been more fitting for him to say they shall become one soul. But he intentionally chose flesh, emphasizing the physical relationship. And since the one flesh concept is linked with the leaving and cleaving principles for marriage, then it makes sense to say that the Bible intends for sex to be within the bonds of marriage only. And like I said, as we appeal to Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus references this whole passage and subject, he says, "What God has joined together, let not man separate." It's God authorizing the marriage. It's God authorizing the sexual union, not man. That's what Jesus is ultimately acknowledging. But Genesis is not the only place where marriage and sex are linked together. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul provided instructions about sex and marriage, apparently in response to some issues brought up by the Corinthian congregation in the first verse. In this passage, Paul reiterates God's parameter for sex inside of the marriage relationship. Notice specifically what he says here in verse 4 and verse 5. He says, let me get where I can read this better. "For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." I don't think we acknowledge the significance of that passage enough, because that is the most equality statement you'll find in Scripture between men and women. In the marital relationship, no one has sole sovereignty over themselves. In the context of marriage, both parties exist for the sexual fulfillment of their spouse. The marriage relationship was designed with the intent of being the avenue through which sexual satisfaction is achieved. No other relationship is granted such authority. No other relationship requires that level of equality. The sexual relationship in the context of marriage is intended to be unique to marriage. Paul goes on to give this instruction: "Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." Paul's instructions here to not deprive one another is indicating that within the context of marriage, the sexual relationship is so important that you don't let it slip, that you don't overlook it, that you don't weaponize it, that you don't use it selfishly. contextually, you have this dynamic only applicable to marriage, and it is more significant than any other responsibility that a human relationship has. Paul goes on to explain why he does not want husbands and wives to deprive one another when he says, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, I want you to think about this. Since Satan tempts us to do things outside of God's will, this statement reinforces the idea that sexual immorality happens when sexual activity occurs outside of marriage. Since Satan tempts us to do things outside of God's will, Paul's statement, or Paul's instructions to not deprive one another so that Satan may not tempt you, it reinforces the idea that sexual immorality happens when sexual activity occurs outside of marriage. It's reinforcing this boundary that sexual activity is limited to the marriage relationship. In fact, if we were to back up to verse 2, we're going to see that Paul is answering issues brought up by the Corinthian congregants regarding the subject of sexual relationships. And he's going to, in verse 2, say, because of the temptation to sexual immorality, here's the instructions he's going to give them. That phrase, sexual immorality, comes up a number of times in Scripture. Do you really know what sexual immorality means? Just to give you a dictionary definition for it, it means illicit sexual intercourse. Now, I'm kind of dumb, so I needed more definition for the word illicit. That which is illegal or unethical. So illegal or unethical sexual intercourse. Okay. Well, what's illegal and what's unethical? Well, we're not going to focus on the illegal as much because illegal in the context of our country does not apply to sexual matters that much. There are some things that are illegal sexually in our country, but it's fairly narrow. So let's go with unethical. And to understand what God deems unethical, the best place to start is to look at what he outlawed in Mosaic law. Now, we're not under Mosaic law anymore, but if you want a starting point for knowing what God considered to be sin and what God considered to not be sin, it's always good to go see what he outlined in Mosaic law and start from there. Then you bring it into the New Testament and see if it maintains itself, or if he starts approving things that he outlawed in the Old Testament, like kosher meat, things like that. But let's think in terms of the sexual relationship. Under Mosaic law, you had at least 4 specific categories of immoral sexual relationships, just spelled out in the book in Leviticus chapter 18. Now, you may be sitting there thinking there's got to be more than these 4. And there is. These are broad categories. The 4 broad categories specifically spelled out in Leviticus 18 that are immoral sexual relationships are incest, adultery, homosexuality, and bestiality. Incest is the biggest category in that chapter, oddly enough. There is more said about incest than any of the other ones. And that's like the one that's the easiest for us to get. That's the one that we tend to stay away from the best. But that included things like there are some polygamy aspects to the incest one. Like you can't have your wife and your wife's mother or your wife's sister. It's not just incest within your side of the family, it's incest with your spouse's side of the family too. So that's why that one has a lot more details to it. But incest, adultery, homosexuality, and bestiality, those are the 4 big ones. When you say adultery there, you need to understand that includes premarital sex. Because if you're having sex with someone that you're not married to, categorically in the Old Testament, you're committing adultery. So, those are the 4 big categories under Mosaic law. I'm not saying there could be some nuances and some specifics that don't fall in those 4 big categories, but those are the big ones. And if you go to Leviticus chapter 18, and I'm not sure if, I think I recorded. No, I didn't. Leviticus chapter 18, and you look at verse 3 and 4, it explains why these are forbidden, why these specific categories are forbidden. Leviticus chapter 18 and verse 3 says, "You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan to which I am bringing you." He says this before he provides this list. In other words, he's saying these things are practiced by the world, and they are contrary to my will. And so you are not going to engage in these sexual relationships because they are of the world. They are worldly. If you keep reading in Leviticus chapter 18 and read verse 4, God goes on to say, well, let me read the two verses together. "You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan to which I am bringing you. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them." These are outlawed by God because they are worldly, and he's called his people to be holy. So these sexual relationships are by default not holy in God's eyes, and that's why they're forbidden. In fact, they would categorically make you unclean in the eyes of God, according to verses 24 and 25 of Leviticus 18. And by verse 29 of Leviticus 18, we're told that they separate you from God's people. If you engage in these activities, you're separated from God's people, and you may even have to face death, because every one of these categories has a death clause attached to it in Mosaic law somewhere outside of this chapter. So, if we're to boil down what illicit sexual immorality includes, we know it's going to include these four things. And then we have to understand that some of these are broader than we realize. Like adultery, it includes premarital sex. We are the ones who have decided we need to categorize that out as something separate, just so you know. But when we consider what is sexual immorality, here's our starting point. And then let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 now and look at verse 1 through 3. I've been saying, if you look at verse 1, it appears that the Corinthians had some questions for Paul. They say, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Paul says that's good. He's saying if you can remain celibate, that's a good thing. Paul himself is that. He'll later in the chapter encourage people with the gift of singleness to remain single, because then they don't have these distractions or these other concerns. But then in verse 2 he says, "But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband." He's saying if you can't control yourself sexually, then you need to get married, because that's the only way you are authorized by God to have sex. And then verse 3, "The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband." In other words, he's telling the Corinthians, you have a responsibility to one another once you're married. You're the prevention for sexual immorality for one another. Your relationship is designed for sexual fulfillment so that you don't have the urge to engage in one of these immoral activities. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is an incredibly important chapter for us understanding God's view of the sexual relationship and just how important it is. Paul's instructions here to husbands and wives indicate that the sexual relationship is limited to the marital relationship, and that any sexual activity outside of marriage is categorically sexual immorality. In fact, Paul's instructions indicate that one purpose of the marriage relationship is to serve as a preventative for sexual immorality. So Paul is saying that if you want to ensure that you don't engage in sexual immorality, then you need to get married so that you can have someone with whom you can share that intimate experience. And if you journey back to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, just a few verses before this chapter begins, you will see that Paul says, "Do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh." What Paul is saying here is a reiteration of that one flesh passage from Genesis chapter 2, that is a reference to the sexual relationship. And no matter if you're married or not, you compromise that marital expectation when you engage in sexual immorality with someone who's not your wife. Paul condemned sexual interaction with someone other than your spouse in this passage because it infringes on the one flesh dynamic that God specifically created for marriage. We'll also need to acknowledge that the author of Hebrews says this in chapter 13 and verse 4, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. Again, reiterating that any sexual activity outside the bonds of marriage is, in the eyes of God, immoral. One of the authors I've used frequently in this study says it this way: there is not one instance in all of God's word where God advocates or celebrates sex outside of a marriage relationship between a husband and a wife. Not one instance. So when we think about sexual ethics, we start with the fact that God created it, and sex is good, but it has limitations on when it can be. I almost said the word used, and I'm like, well, that doesn't sound right. When it can be applied. There we go. One last thing I do want to say in the context of our general overview of sexual ethics is that God expects self-control when it comes to sex. Paul instructed Christians in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 3, I do not have that passage up there, to abstain from sexual immorality. That means avoiding or refraining from sexual immorality. He then goes on in verse 4 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 to instruct us to know how to control our own bodies in holiness and honor. That's a call for self-control when it comes to sexual temptation. So God says, hey, God creates sex and it's good. Here's my boundaries around it. Now you have to practice self-control based on my boundaries. God always expects self-control when it comes to sexual relationship, or sexual activity, I should say. That's part of what we need to fit into the equation of understanding sexual ethics. That everyone is expected to practice control over their sexual urges. But as I've done in previous lessons, I like to give a big ethical picture. And this one's a little bit different. When I think about the big ethical picture of sexual ethics, it seems to me that God is not only concerned with whether or not we are pure externally, but whether or not we are pure internally as well. Sexual morality is not just a matter of not engaging in the physical act of sexual immorality. It's also a matter of being sexually pure in your heart. And I say that because of Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 5. When he says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell." What Jesus is saying here is that your purity extends not just to your external body, but to your internal state of mind and heart. Not only do we have this passage, but you can think about Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 3. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 3, we are instructed for there not to be even a hint of sexual immorality among us, or for sexual immorality to not even be named among you. The idea is that there is no association anyone can make between you and something that's sexually immoral. That's how pure you're supposed to be. And I want you to think in order for there not to be even a hint of sexual immorality among you or among us, our abstention from sexual immorality must not only include avoiding the physical act of sexual immorality, but it must also include the pursuit of purity in mind, in speech, in appearance, etc. Sexual purity, a sexually pure ethic, extends beyond physical activity, and it addresses everything from the inside out. Because Jesus does elsewhere say that where does sexual immorality come from? It comes from inside. It comes from your heart. And so you've got to start with purity there in order for you to have a sexually pure ethic. And so that's the big ethical picture. And that leaves open a lot of arenas for us to address in this particular area. We spent several weeks addressing many life and death ethics. We're going to spend several weeks here too, because we have to deal with subjects like homosexuality, gender identity, pornography, things like that. And so there is much to address in this particular arena. And we need to start here, knowing that God created sex, and it is good. That God put boundaries around it, limiting it to marriage. That God expects everyone to control themselves when it comes to sexual immorality. And that, number 4, sexual morality is more than just abstaining from physical sexual conduct that is immoral. With that being said, I'm going to stop there, check my texts, see if there's any to address, and then we'll open it up beyond that. Okay, so here's a question. It's asking, can sexual immorality include things other besides actual intercourse? So if other things occur that aren't intercourse, is that the same as adultery? Since lust is considered the same as adultery. Let me address this in a multifaceted way. Number 1, I do believe that sexual immorality includes other things besides intercourse, because you do have an issue of lust that Jesus spoke of. Actually, I'm just going to leave it there. Yes, I do believe that sexual immorality can include things outside of physical intercourse, because Jesus equated lust with sexual immorality. I do think the conversation we don't have enough of in the church is addressing exactly how far is too far, particularly for those in the dating field. We don't want to get specific on that. I don't intend to right now, but during the course of this sexual ethics study, we're going to need to get there. And so we'll come back around to that at a later point in this study. But yes, we need to acknowledge that just because that we need to acknowledge that intercourse is not the only form of sexual immorality. I received another question asking about concubines, particularly referencing like Solomon and characters like that. The question just says, what about concubines? So I'm not exactly sure the pinpointed point, but I'll just say this. we can just say it simply. Solomon did some sexually immoral things. If you actually study Solomon, you could question whether or not he made it to heaven. I'm not trying to cast judgment or anything, but his life story and his actions, man, yes. Concubines, to me, are categorically, and granted, Solomon's not the only one to have concubines, but to me, categorically sexually immoral. One of the gray areas, Old Testament speaking, of sexual immorality is polygamy. You notice I didn't have that as a specific item on the list. That one is very much in the Old Testament, I would say in the gray area, because you have these men who are renowned for their faith and praised in the New Testament that had multiple wives, like David. He had like 7 wives. But by the time you get to the New Testament, it becomes very clear in the New Testament that God's word is getting more explicit about this one man, one woman category that kind of started in Genesis. But by the time you get to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, by the time you get to Jesus, actually, it's one man, one woman, no more. Polygamy in the New Testament is forbidden, whereas in the Old Testament, it's not entirely forbidden. I'd say it almost comes across almost more frowned upon. There is in the Mosaic Law instructions for future kings not to multiply horses and not to multiply wives. But it kind of gets a little bit ignored. And God doesn't necessarily come back and say, hey, you shouldn't have done that. It's kind of this weird situation there. That might come up again as well. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. With the princesses / wives, those are the ones who have that official standing royally. The concubines don't. I have never spent time really studying what a concubine entails, but to me, my cursory, limited, surface level understanding is that they basically are just there for sex. But whereas the wives or the princesses are actual standing in a royal position, usually married for the purpose of alignment with other nations and things like that, whereas the concubines have no real standing. Now, granted, if anybody has studied concubines more than me, 1, that's a little bit weird. 2, feel free to speak up and share your knowledge because I've never really sat down and studied that. But we've got a few minutes left, so I will field questions verbally now. Anybody want, and granted, this is one of those kind of topics you kind of don't really want to ask too much on, but anybody want to ask questions now? Or if you want to pose some things that you want me to bring up in the future lessons related to sexual ethics, things you want to know about. You know, when we were doing life and death, y'all were all talkative. Rich. Mm-hmm. typically, but then you can go pre-kings and go with Jacob. And you have that scenario of multiple wives. Yeah. Wasn't initially. Well, the reason he had more, I'm not really understanding what you're saying, but the reason he had more than one wife, is because he had a father-in-law who was a jerk. I mean, he got tricked into marrying one, and he respected God's law enough not to just kick her to the curb. So that was his situation was fairly unique. But my real point is, you don't have a prophet showing up and condemning these kings or condemning Jacob for having multiple wives, whereas when you have David run off and commit adultery with Bathsheba, you got a prophet showing up at his door saying, hey, something ain't right. So the Old Testament is unique in this arena, but I do intend at some point to address polygamy in particular, because it's kind of that area where we have Old Testament teaching that kind of seems different than New Testament teaching, but I don't think the Bible is inconsistent. I think there's more to it than that, but great observation. Appreciate comments. Nikki, did you have something else?
Another thing, it's not specified if somebody came and talked to Solomon about it.
No.
They might have.
It may not have been recorded. It's always fair to say, yes. Always fair to observe that. I heard my name. Oh, Wayne.
Just an observation, because in the church we don't talk about this a lot, it affects the church greatly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's at some point that we're going to have to address it, because when it affects the church, it affects the church.
Yeah. Now,
Because we don't talk about it, and I think elders or preachers or just the common era of where we live now or where we came from, it was sort of taboo to talk about it, and most people let their leadership, let their families talk about it. Well, God put it in the Bible for a reason, for preachers to teach on it and elders to teach on it. So we don't make those mistakes. It does have to be able to talk about it.
yeah. Now, I will say I'm separating marriage out from this. We're going to have marital ethics is going to be its own category as well, just so we can draw that distinction, because, polygamy is kind of both. But we will be addressing marital ethics separately from this, and that's probably the way in which sexual ethics affects us the most, is through additionally marital ethics. Anything else anybody wants to bring up, or things you'd like to have explored as we study sexual ethics moving forward? Anybody just can't wait to get out of this room and not hear the word sex anymore? Or online, for that matter? All right. Well, we will just go ahead and wrap up early so you can make it home before this winter storm, in case you have a long commute. But thank you for your time, attention, participation. And next week, hope you'll be back with us to study this subject in more detail in a specific category. You have a blessed night.